Margaret Hayes stood behind the counter of her small diner on Route 9, watching the morning sun paint the Oklahoma sky in shades of orange and pink. At 52, she'd learned to ignore the way men's eyes passed over her like she was invisible furniture. The diner had been hers for 3 years now, ever since she'd retired from the Army after serving 28 years as a combat medic. "More coffee, sweetheart?" she asked the trucker in booth 3, pot already in hand. He grunted without looking up from his phone. Margaret filled his cup anyway, her movements efficient and practiced. The bells above the door chimed, and 3 men in their 30s walked in, their boots loud against the checkered floor. They wore leather vests and had that swagger that came from thinking the world owed them something. "Sit anywhere you like," Margaret called out, already reaching for menus. The tallest one, with a scar running down his cheek, looked her up and down and smirked. "Hey boys, looks like Grandma's working the breakfast shift." His friends laughed. Margaret felt the familiar tightening in her chest but kept her face neutral. She'd heard worse, much worse. "What can I get you gentlemen?" she asked, setting the menus on their table. "How about someone younger to look at while we eat?" Scarface said. "No offense, lady, but you're a little old to be waitressing, don't you think?" Margaret met his eyes steadily. "The pancakes are good, so's the coffee, everything else is extra." She turned away before they could respond, heading back behind the counter. Their laughter followed her. In the kitchen, she took a deep breath and started their order. Her hands didn't shake as she cracked eggs onto the griddle. 28 years in the Army had taught her control. The morning crowd came and went. Margaret served them all with the same quiet efficiency, ignoring the occasional comment about her age, her looks, or her unmarried status. The town of Weatherford wasn't cruel exactly, just thoughtless. To most people, a woman over 50 was either someone's wife, someone's mother, or someone to overlook entirely. Around 2 in the afternoon, when the lunch rush had died down, Margaret heard the deep rumble of motorcycles outside. She glanced through the window and saw 5 bikes pulling into the parking lot. Real Hell's Angels, not the weekend warriors who'd come in that morning. She could tell by the patches on their vests, the road-worn leather, the way they moved with the stiffness of men who'd been riding hard. 4 of them walked in together, laughing about something. The 5th man limped behind them, favoring his right leg badly. He was big, probably 6'3", with gray threading through his dark hair and beard. His face was weathered and hard, but his blue eyes were sharp as he scanned the diner. "Table for 5, Margaret asked. "Yeah," one of them answered, a stocky man with arms covered in tattoos. "Somewhere we can stretch out. We've been riding since Amarillo." Margaret led them to the large corner booth. The limping man slid in last, and she saw him wince as he bent his leg. Old injury, she thought, the kind that never really healed right. "What can I get you boys?" They ordered enough food for 10 people. When Margaret returned with their drinks, she overheard their conversation. "Jake, you gotta see a doctor about that leg," the tattooed one was saying. "You can barely walk." The limping man, Jake, shook his head. "Doctors just want to cut. I'm done with hospitals." "You can't ride like this, brother." "I'll manage." Margaret set down their drinks and caught Jake looking at her. Unlike the men from that morning, his gaze wasn't dismissive. It was assessing, like he was trying to figure something out. "You military?" he asked suddenly. Margaret paused. "Was Army medic, retired 3 years ago." He nodded slowly. "Thought so, you got that look. My old man was Army, Korea." 28 years for me," Margaret said. "Did 2 tour in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan." The other men at the table had gone quiet, watching this exchange. "That's real service," Jake said. "Respect." It was such a simple thing, those 2 words, but something in Margaret's chest loosened. When was the last time someone had looked at her and seen past the gray in her hair? "Thank you," she said. "I'll get your food out soon." In the kitchen, Margaret found herself thinking about Jake's leg. She'd seen that particular kind of limp before. Probably shrapnel damage, maybe a broken bone that hadn't set right. The way he moved suggested nerve damage too. When she brought out their food, she couldn't help herself. "That leg," she said to Jake, "how long have you been dealing with it?" He looked surprised. 6 years, IED in Kandahar. They put me back together, but some things don't fix. You were Army. Marine, 3 tour before the blast sent me home. Margaret nodded. She treated hundreds of blast injuries. You got full range of motion. Maybe 60%. Why? Because you're compensating wrong, that's why it's getting worse. She caught herself. Sorry, old habits. But Jake was leaning forward now, interested. What do you mean, compensating wrong? The way you're walking, you're putting all the stress on your hip to avoid bending the knee. But that's making your hip worse, which makes you lean more, which makes the knee stiffer. It's a cycle. Doctors told me I need surgery. Maybe, but you might just need better physical therapy. The kind they don't usually give unless you push for it. Margaret shrugged. Like I said, old habits. I'll let you eat. She started to turn away, but Jake's voice stopped her. You got time to sit down, just for a minute. Margaret glanced around the diner. Only 2 other tables were occupied, both with coffee and pie, nothing urgent. I suppose I could. She slid into the booth across from Jake while his friends exchanged glances. Up close, she could see the scars on his hands, the way his right eye drooped slightly, more blast damage. He'd been close to that IED when it went off. Name's Jake Morrison, he said, extending a hand. Margaret Hayes. His grip was firm, calloused. These are my brothers, Jake continued, gesturing to the others. We ride together, watch each other's backs. You came from Amarillo. Heading to Tulsa for a rally, but we might stay in town tonight if there's a decent motel. That leg's killing me, and I'm not too proud to admit it. Margaret made a decision. There's a motel up the road, clean enough, but if you want, I could show you some exercises that might help with the immediate pain. No charge, just one veteran to another. Jake studied her face for a long moment. Why would you do that? Because I can, and because nobody should have to hurt if there's a simple fix. Lady, said the tattooed man, no offense, but Jake's been to a dozen specialists. What makes you think? I treated blast injuries for 3 years in Kandahar, Margaret interrupted quietly. I've seen hundreds of cases like his. I'm not saying I can fix everything, but I can probably help with the immediate pain. Jake was still watching her, those blue eyes thoughtful. Finally, he smiled. It transformed his whole face, made him look younger. All right, Margaret Hayes, I'll take you up on that. They finished their meal, talking easily about their service, the places they'd been, the things they'd seen. Margaret found herself laughing at Jake's stories about his motorcycle club, the brothers who'd become his family after the Corps. His friends warmed up to her too, especially when she started sharing her own stories from the field hospitals. You saved lives, Jake said at one point, his voice serious. Real lives, that matters. So did you, Margaret replied. We all did our part. When they were ready to leave, Jake lingered while his friends headed out to the bikes. About those exercises, he said. You serious about that? I close up at 7. There's a community center 2 blocks down with an open gym. Meet me there at 7:30 if you want. Jake nodded. I'll be there. Margaret watched through the window as they mounted their bikes and rode away, Jake moving carefully, protecting that leg. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than invisible. The afternoon passed slowly. The men from that morning came back in, still making jokes about her age, still treating her like she was part of the scenery. But their words didn't sting the way they usually did. She had somewhere to be. Someone who'd looked at her and seen not an old woman but a fellow soldier. Someone who'd said respect and meant it. At 7 o'clock, Margaret locked up the diner and headed home to change. She stood in front of her closet, then laughed at herself. It wasn't a date. It was just therapy. She pulled on comfortable clothes and grabbed the old gym bag she hadn't touched since retirement. At 7:30 sharp, Jake Morrison walked into the community center gym, and Margaret Hayes remembered what it felt like to be seen. The community center gym smelled like old rubber mats and cleaning solution. Margaret had already set up in the corner, laying out the foam rollers and resistance bands she'd brought from home. When Jake walked in, she noticed he'd changed out of his leather vest into a simple t-shirt and jeans, making the scars on his arms more visible. "You showed up," she said. "Said I would." Jake lowered himself carefully onto the mat she'd laid out. "Fair warning, though, I'm not flexible. Haven't been able to touch my toes since 2018. "That's not the goal." Margaret knelt beside him. "First, I need to see exactly what we're working with. I'm going to touch your leg, check the range of motion. That okay?" Jake nodded. As Margaret's experienced hands moved along his knee, testing the joint, she could feel the scar tissue. The way the kneecap didn't track quite right. But she'd been right about the compensation pattern. His hip was a mess because he'd been protecting the knee for so long. "Okay," she said, "here's what we're going to do." For the next hour, Margaret walked Jake through a series of exercises. Some were for the knee, gentle movements to encourage proper tracking, but most were for the hip and lower back, undoing years of compensation. She showed him how to use the foam roller, how to stretch the tight muscles without aggravating the damaged ones. Jake followed her instructions without complaint, even when she could see the sweat beading on his forehead from pain. "You're tough," Margaret observed, "but you knew that." "Had good teachers. The core doesn't let you quit," he grunted as he held a particularly difficult stretch. "You're good at this, really good." "I had good teachers too." Margaret adjusted his position slightly. "There was a physical therapist at Landstuhl, guy named Patterson. He taught me that surgery isn't always the answer. Sometimes the body just needs to remember how it's supposed to work." Landstuhl, the big military hospital in Germany. "Yeah, I was stationed there between my second and third deployments. Learned more in 6 months there than in 2 years of medical training." When they finished, Jake stood up slowly. He took a few experimental steps and his eyes widened. "It's better, not perfect, but better." "It'll be sore tomorrow," Margaret warned. "You're using muscles that have been dormant, but if you do these exercises every day, the pain should decrease within a week." Jake looked at her with something like wonder. "All those specialists, all that money, and you fixed it in an hour." "I didn't fix it. I just reminded your body what normal feels like. You'll have to keep doing the work." "I will." Jake grabbed his jacket from the bench. "Can I buy you dinner, as a thank you?" Margaret hesitated. "You don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to, I want to," he smiled. "Besides, your diner's closed and I'm starving. You know anywhere good in this town?" They ended up at a steakhouse on Main Street. It was the kind of place Margaret rarely went to, too expensive for her budget, too fancy for eating alone. But Jake insisted, and something in his earnest expression made it impossible to refuse. Over dinner they talked, really talked. Jake told her about his life before the Marines, growing up in Nevada with a father who drank and a mother who left. The Corps had saved him, given him purpose. Then the blast had taken it all away. "When I came home, I didn't know who I was anymore," Jake said, cutting into his steak. "Couldn't work a regular job, couldn't sit still, couldn't sleep. The club found me about 2 years after I got out. Gave me a new family, a new purpose." "But you're still hurting," Margaret said gently. "Every day, and not just the leg." He tapped his chest. "In here too. The VA gives me pills, but pills don't fix what's really broken." Margaret understood. She'd seen it in so many veterans, the invisible wounds that ran deeper than any shrapnel. "What helps?" "The road, my brothers, knowing I'm not alone." Jake met her eyes. "What about you? You seem like you got your life together, but I see it in you too, that look." Margaret set down her fork. Nobody had asked her that question in 3 years. I don't sleep well. I see faces sometimes, people I couldn't save. And I came back to a town where nobody understands what I did or why it mattered. They see a middle-aged woman running a diner. They don't see the soldier. I see her, Jake said quietly. The words hung between them, simple and profound. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them away, embarrassed. Sorry, she said, I don't usually. Don't apologize, not for that, not ever. They talked until the restaurant closed, sharing stories that only another veteran would understand. The fear, the adrenaline, the dark humor that got you through impossible situations, the guilt of coming home when others didn't. When they finally left, Jake walked her to her car, his limp noticeably improved. I know this is forward, he said, but we're staying in town a few more days. My brothers want to see some sights, and honestly, my leg needs the rest. Could I see you again? Maybe take you to dinner tomorrow. Margaret's heart beat faster. How long had it been since a man had asked her on a real date? Since someone had looked at her with interest instead of indifference? I'd like that, she said. The next day at the diner, Margaret caught herself smiling as she worked. Even the rude comments from the morning regulars couldn't dampen her mood. She had plans. Someone wanted to see her again. You're chipper today, observed Betty, her part-time waitress. Betty was 65 and had known Margaret since she'd bought the diner. What's going on? Nothing, Margaret said, but she couldn't stop smiling. Don't give me that, you meet someone. Maybe. Betty's eyes lit up. Tell me everything. But before Margaret could answer, the door opened and the 3 men from yesterday walked in, Scarface and his friends. They took the same booth, and Scarface immediately started in. Hey, Grandma's still here. Thought you'd have retired to a nursing home by now. His friends laughed. Margaret felt her good mood evaporate. What can I get you? She asked, voice flat. How about a smile? Oh wait, you're too old for that. All those wrinkles might crack. More laughter. Margaret turned away, her face hot. She'd dealt with worse, she reminded herself. She'd survived war zones. These idiots were nothing. But somehow it hurt more today. Yesterday she'd felt seen, valued. Today she was invisible again. She was bringing out their food when Scarface stuck his foot out. Margaret, carrying 3 plates, didn't see it in time. She stumbled and the plates went flying. Food splattered across the floor, across her apron, across Scarface's boots. Jesus, lady, watch where you're going, he shouted, jumping up. You tripped me, Margaret said, her voice shaking with anger. I didn't do nothing. You're just clumsy, too old to be doing this job. The diner had gone quiet. Everyone was watching. Margaret felt humiliation wash over her, hot and choking. I think you should leave, she said. Scarface stepped closer, towering over her. Or what? You gonna kick me out, Grandma? You and what army? That would be me. The voice came from the doorway. Margaret turned to see Jake Morrison standing there, his 4 brothers behind him. He wasn't limping anymore, the exercises had helped that much. But more than that, he looked dangerous. They all did. Scarface paled slightly. This isn't your business. Lady's a veteran, served her country for almost 3 decades while you were probably still in diapers. Jake walked forward, his movements controlled and deliberate. You tripped her on purpose. I saw it through the window. So what? So you're going to apologize, then you're going to leave, and you're not coming back. And if I don't? Jake smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. Then we're going to have a problem, and trust me, you don't want problems with us. The other Hell's Angels had fanned out, blocking the exits. They didn't say anything. They didn't have to. Their presence was enough. Scarface looked around, calculating odds he didn't like. Whatever, this dump has terrible service anyway. He looked at Margaret. Sorry or whatever. Not good enough, Jake said. A real apology. Scarface's jaw clenched. I'm sorry I tripped you, ma'am. It won't happen again. Because you're never coming back here, Jake added. Right. Right, fine, we're leaving. The three men practically ran out of the diner. The silence that followed was deafening. Then Betty started clapping. Soon the whole diner joined in. Margaret stood there covered in food, tears running down her face. But they were tears of relief, of gratitude. Jake walked over to her. "You okay?" "I am now." Margaret wiped her eyes. "Thank you, you didn't have to do that." "Yeah, I did." He touched her arm gently. "Nobody disrespects my girl like that." Margaret's breath caught. "Your girl." Jake's face reddened slightly. "I mean, if you want to be. I know it's fast and we just met, but—" Margaret kissed him. Right there in front of everyone, surrounded by spilled food and broken plates, she kissed him. And Jake Morrison kissed her back. When they broke apart, the diner erupted in cheers. "So was that a yes?" Jake asked, grinning. 3 months later, Margaret locked the diner at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening and walked out to find Jake waiting on his motorcycle. He'd been staying in Weatherford, finding odd jobs, helping Margaret with repairs around the diner. His brothers came through every few weeks, but Jake had found something in this small Oklahoma town worth staying for. "Ready for dinner?" he asked, handing her a helmet. Margaret climbed on behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist. She'd learned to love the motorcycle, the freedom of the open road, the wind in her face. At 52, she was learning to live again. But as they rode through town, Margaret noticed something odd. People were staring, more than usual. Some were pointing. "Jake," she said into his ear, "something's going on." He pulled up to the steakhouse, and Margaret understood why. The parking lot was full of motorcycles, at least 30 of them. Hell's Angels from all over Oklahoma and beyond. "What is this?" Margaret asked as Jake helped her off the bike. "You'll see." Inside, the restaurant had been transformed. Banners hung on the walls and the room was packed with bikers and their families. But there were also others, people Margaret recognized from town, from the diner. Betty was there, and Sam from the hardware store. Even Mayor Patterson was standing by the bar. "What's going on?" Margaret asked again. Jake led her to the front of the room where a microphone stood. He took it, and the crowd quieted. "Most of you know why we're here," Jake began. "But for those who don't, let me tell you a story. 3 months ago, I rolled into Weatherford with a bum leg and not much hope. I walked into a diner and met a woman named Margaret Hayes. She was serving coffee and taking orders, and a bunch of punks were calling her grandma and treating her like she was invisible. People murmured. Several looked uncomfortable. They'd been in that diner, Margaret realized. They'd heard the comments and said nothing. What those punks didn't know," Jake continued, "was that Margaret Hayes is a hero. She served 28 years in the Army as a combat medic. She did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan. She saved lives, real lives, American lives, and she came home to a town that couldn't see past her age." Jake looked at Margaret, his eyes warm. "She helped me when she didn't have to, fixed my leg when a dozen specialists couldn't. And more than that, she reminded me what it means to serve, to care about people even when they don't deserve it." He turned back to the crowd. "So I called in some favors, because Margaret Hayes deserves to be recognized, not just by me but by everyone." A man in a military uniform stepped forward. Margaret's eyes widened as she recognized the insignia. He was a full colonel. "Ms. Hayes," the colonel said, "I'm Colonel David Martinez, and I've been reviewing your service record. It's exemplary. 3 bronze stars, 2 purple hearts, and a silver star for gallantry in action. You saved 47 lives during an attack on your field hospital in Kandahar, refusing to evacuate until every wounded soldier was stable." Margaret's throat tightened. She tried to forget that day, the mortars falling, the screams, the blood. "You were recommended for higher honors," the colonel continued, "but the paperwork was lost in the chaos of withdrawal. I've taken the liberty of correcting that oversight." He opened a box and pulled out a medal. "Margaret Hayes, On behalf of the United States Army and a grateful nation, I present you with the Distinguished Service Medal for exceptionally meritorious service in a position of great responsibility." The room erupted in applause. Margaret stood frozen as the colonel pinned the medal to her chest. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. But Jake wasn't done. He took the microphone again. "There's more. See, I've been talking to folks around town. Turns out a lot of people have been thinking about how we treat our veterans, how we see people or don't see them." Mayor Patterson stepped forward. "Ms. Hayes, I want to apologize on behalf of Weatherford. We should have honored your service years ago. We should have made sure you knew how much you matter to this community." He cleared his throat. "Which is why the town council has voted unanimously to rename the corner where your diner sits. It's now going to be Veterans Square, and we're putting up a memorial to all Weatherford residents who have served." Margaret's legs felt weak. Jake was there immediately, his arm around her waist, holding her up. "And one more thing," Jake said softly just for her. "These past 3 months have been the best of my life. You've given me hope, purpose, and more happiness than I thought possible. I know I'm broken. I know I'm not much, but if you'll have me." He dropped to one knee, pulling a small box from his pocket. The room went silent. "Margaret Hayes, will you marry me?" Margaret looked at him, this broken, beautiful man who'd seen her when nobody else did, who'd defended her, honored her, loved her. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "yes." The room erupted again. Jake slipped the ring on her finger and stood, kissing her while the crowd cheered. His brothers were whistling and hollering. Betty was crying. Even the colonel was smiling. Later, after the celebration had died down, Margaret and Jake sat outside on a bench, watching the stars. "I can't believe you did all that," Margaret said, turning the ring on her finger. "It was simple, a single diamond on a silver band, and it was perfect." "You deserved it. You deserve everything." Jake pulled her close. "All those people who called you old, who couldn't see you, they were blind. You're the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I've ever met." "I'm still 52, Margaret said. "I've got gray hair and wrinkles and you're perfect for me," Jake interrupted. "Every scar, every year, every experience that made you who you are, it's all perfect. I don't want some young girl who doesn't understand what we've been through. I want you, just you." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "I love you, Jake Morrison." "I love you too, Margaret Hayes, soon to be Margaret Morrison." They sat in comfortable silence, two broken soldiers who'd found each other in a small Oklahoma town, who'd learned that being seen, really seen, was worth more than any medal or recognition. The next morning, Margaret opened the diner as usual, but something was different. People greeted her warmly. Several thanked her for her service. A group of veterans she didn't know came in, wanting to meet the woman who'd been honored the night before. And when a young man in his 20s made a thoughtless comment about her age, 3 regulars immediately shut him down. "That's Margaret Hayes," one of them said firmly. "She's a war hero, show some respect." The young man apologized immediately, his face red. Margaret smiled to herself as she poured coffee. She was the same person she'd been yesterday before the ceremony, but now people could see her, really see her. Jake came in around noon, his limp barely noticeable now. He'd been faithful with the exercises, and his mobility had improved dramatically. He slid into a booth, and Margaret brought him coffee without asking. "How's my fiancé?" he asked, grinning. "Still getting used to that word." Margaret sat across from him. "Still getting used to all of this." "Better get used to it fast. I'm not going anywhere." Jake reached across the table and took her hand. "I was thinking, once we're married, maybe we could expand this place. Make it a real veterans hangout. Good food, good company, a place where people who have served can feel at home." "I'd like that," Margaret said. "I'd like that a lot." That evening, after the diner closed, they rode out to the lake on Jake's motorcycle. Margaret had packed a picnic, and they sat by the water watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "Can I tell you something?" Jake said, his arm around her shoulders. "Anything." "When I first saw you in that diner, I thought you were the most interesting person in the room. Not because you were serving food or because you looked like anything special, but because of the way you carried yourself. Like you'd seen things, done things, survived things. I recognized it because I felt the same way." "I felt invisible," Margaret admitted. "For 3 years, I felt like nobody really saw me." "I saw you, from the first minute." Jake kissed her temple. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never feel invisible again." Margaret turned to face him, cupping his scarred, beautiful face in her hands. "I see you too, all of you, the broken parts and the strong parts and everything in between, and I love all of it." They kissed as the sun sank below the horizon, two souls who'd been lost and were now found. Two veterans who'd learned that the battles you fight at home, for recognition, for respect, for love, could be just as important as the ones fought overseas. 6 months later, Margaret and Jake stood before a small gathering of friends, family, and Hell's Angels, exchanging vows in the garden behind the expanded diner. Margaret wore a simple white dress, and Jake wore his dress uniform from the Marines, medals gleaming in the sunlight. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jake dipped Margaret dramatically and kissed her while everyone cheered. As they walked back down the aisle together, Margaret caught sight of the new sign hanging over the diner. Margaret's Place, a veteran's home. She was 53 now. Her hair was grayer. Her face had more lines. But when she looked in Jake's eyes, she saw herself reflected there, not as an old woman, not as invisible, but as a warrior, a healer, a survivor, and a beloved wife. Every man in town had called her old, until a broken Hell's Angel looked past the years and saw her truth. And in seeing her, he'd helped her see herself again. That night, as they danced at their reception, surrounded by bikers and townspeople and fellow veterans, Margaret Hayes Morrison realized something profound. Being seen wasn't about being young or beautiful by society's standards. It was about finding someone who valued your strength, honored your scars, and loved you for everything you'd survived. She'd found her someone, and together they'd found their home. In a small Oklahoma town, in a diner on Veterans Square, two broken soldiers had discovered what everyone deserves to know: that true love doesn't count wrinkles or years. It counts courage, compassion, and the warrior heart that beats beneath.